We're continuing our partnership with Learn Liberty this week, and joining me today is an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law School, as well as the founder of prisonprofessors.com, Shon Hopwood. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I got to tell you, man, I have been in partnership with Learn Liberty for about a year and a half or so, and it's a great partnership. They send me a list of great professors and academics from all over the country. They say, if you want to talk to any of these people, we'll make them available. Easy enough. You have by far the craziest bio of anyone that they have passed along to me. I suspect you know that in advance.
You don't have many public intellectuals who have gone to federal prison for robbing banks.
You are the first one out of the long, I mean, they've given us lists of hundreds of people that we select out of.
I've gotten used to being the freak show.
Yeah.
At one point it used to bother me, but I tend to embrace it now.
Yeah. So yes, you spent 12 years in a federal prison for bank robbery. We're obviously going to have to hear that story. Should I be concerned at all that this is in my house? You've now seen my security system and everything else?
I think you'll be okay.
Yeah. When I took a meeting while you were sitting in the green room, I thought maybe he could be, doing some stuff. But
yeah, probably emailing with students.
Yeah. All right.
That's my new life these days.
That's your new life. You have cleaned up, you're wearing a suit, you've gone legit, as they say.
I've cleaned up. I brought my First Amendment socks with me.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, giving the finger to the man.
That's right.
All right.
I'm a big believer in the First Amendment. I'm pretty much a First Amendment absolutist.
Me too. All right. Well, then we're in good company here. All right. So here we go. So let's just start with the big story. You've robbed a bank. What are you doing?
Yeah, robbed 5 of them. What was I doing? I was a young 20-year-old man who had no purpose in life and did not weigh out the consequences of my actions on myself. So it's not hard to realize that I wasn't really thinking about the consequences of my actions on anyone else. And everyone always wants to, what was the big reason why? And the reason is I was young and 20 and stupid. And part of my redemption out of that was just growing up.
All right, so just tell me how this even happens. When does the idea of I'll rob a bank, like you can be young and misguided and everything else and do graffiti, you might, steal some stuff from the candy store, etc. Robbing a bank, different level.
Yeah, no, that's right. A friend of mine invited me to the bar in my hometown, sprawling metropolis of 2,500 people in rural Nebraska, and said, hey, what do you think about robbing a bank? And most people would have said, no, you're crazy, laughed, done anything. And my response was, that sounds like a great idea. And so we discussed it over beers, and I don't think either one of us thought we were going to actually do it that night. But we started taking steps, and then once we got into it, it was kind of took me on a downward spiral.
Yeah, so from that conversation to the first robbery, how long was that?
Probably 6 months.
Okay, so now
we had to hype ourselves up to actually do it.
Yeah. So what were those conversations like? I mean, were there multiple plans of how to go about doing this? Was this all like the way you see it in an old Western, just showing up at the teller with the mask? Yeah, give me some.
Yeah, we planned it out. We had stolen a car, went to the bank, ran in the bank with guns, yelled at everyone, grabbed as much money as we could. We never intended to hurt anyone. The guns were there pretty much for show. And then we left and dumped the stolen car and got into a grain truck, because this was August in Nebraska and no one's going to think about bank robbers being in a grain truck. And we drove away.
And you did this 5 times.
Yeah, once we started doing it, I had to use drugs and alcohol to kind of get over the fact that I had a lot of guilt. It's not like I didn't know this was wrong.
Yeah.
And so once we got into it, we started spending money. When you make easy money, it's easy to spend it.
Yeah.
And it just was a year of trying to party.
That's fascinating. So you get all this money, and now the guilt of the action is now the financial part that's fueling your need to do it again.
Yeah,
that's really
and I was going through depression and some other issues, and I needed somebody to say, what are you doing? And I never really got that. And the guys I were with were all in the same place, early 20s, didn't have a job, didn't know what they wanted to do with their life. And we kind of fueled each other for this year-long spree.
Yeah. Putting aside the drugs for a second, I mean, what about the rush of just doing it? I would imagine, even though It's a criminal act, obviously, but just like getting away with something that sounds so crazy.
Yeah, no, it's not really a rush.
Yeah.
Every time you go in the bank, everything in your body is telling you, do not do this. And you kind of have to shut that off.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to shut rational thought down. Because if it was rational, you would not be doing it. If you were thinking rationally, you would not walk into a bank. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I got less than $200,000 for all those banks.
Wow.
I served 11 years in prison and ended up having to pay all the money back anyway. And so rationally, didn't make much sense from a cost-benefit analysis.
Right. So if you're going to get caught, this maybe isn't the best idea.
Well, this is one of the big reasons why we impose long sentences on people in this country, is this belief in general deterrence. If I give you a 20-year sentence, it's going to deter everyone else. All of the literature says that that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah.
The people that commit crimes a lot of it is young men 18 to 25. These are not people that weigh out the consequences. Drug addiction, alcoholism, mental health issues. Again, not people that weigh out the consequences of their actions. But even if they did, let's just pretend they did. What would they have to do to find out how long they would be sentenced for a particular crime? They would have to find one of 5,000 federal statutes that sets the mandatory minimum and maximum penalties. Then they'd have to read a 500-page guideline manual that judges and lawyers misapply every day. To think anyone's actually doing that is ludicrous. I never met one person, 11 years in prison, who knew how much time they were facing. But this is the primary argument that people like the Attorney General and the tough on crime crowd believes we should impose long sentences because it will deter everyone else.
Yeah, so this is what you've really devoted your life to since, and I want to get to all that, obviously, and we just briefly spoke about the Attorney General. I want to talk about him because I'm frustrated about some stuff as well. Okay, so how much time took place for those 5 bank robberies? Like, what kind of time frame are we looking at?
Less than a year.
Less than a year, so within a year. Okay, now you get caught. You end up in a federal prison for, I thought it was 12, you said 11, but maybe
12 years, 3 months was the sentence, but I got good time for behaving in prison.
Okay.
So I served less than 11 years.
Okay, so less than 11 years. Just tell me what that process, even just tell me first what that first day of showing up at a federal prison is like.
It's not what you would think.
It's not Orange is the New Black?
It's not Orange is the New Black. The first day in prison and the first week in prison felt like freedom. And the reason I say that is I was moved around like many people that are pre-trial, from county jail to county jail, where you're locked down maybe 20 hours out of the day. And when I got to prison, I could actually go outside. I hadn't been outside in 9 months.
Wow.
When I got to prison, I could go outside, I could go to the library, I could pick out books, I could do something to occupy my mind. And so the first couple of weeks in prison, outside of the part of being scared to death, felt like more freedom.
Huh. What was the scary part beyond just being incarcerated?
Well,
I mean, like just all the physical threats, or like
physical threats, threats of sexual assault. You know, I watched a lot of people with medical issues die in federal prison because they weren't adequately treated. And you know, then the real punishment is you're cut off from all your family and community ties, which is a problem. Because we know that people that are able to maintain community and family ties is key for people coming out of prison. Especially if you come out of prison, you get a job, and you lose the job or get fired. If you don't have family or some sort of community to fall back on, that's usually when people go back to committing crimes.
Right, and that's part of the reason of high rates of recidivism in all of this stuff. Yeah,
the rates of recidivism in this country are not good. They range from 45% to 75%. We have some state prison systems that within 5 years, everyone leaving the prison, 75% of them will come back. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. Like, putting everything else aside that we're going to talk about for the next hour, if just the idea that you put people here to punish them for this crime, and then more than half, in many cases, and you're saying sometimes significantly more, end up back there. Man, I mean, what a failure, what a true failure. I mean, government programs that fail 3 out of 4 times and no one reevaluates it is disturbing. Yeah. You know, anyone who has an out date and is going to come out of prison, we should be trying to rehabilitate those people for a number of reasons. One, public safety. We do not want people coming out of prison and committing new crimes. new victims. It costs a lot of money to re-prosecute. You got to pay for the prosecutor, the judge, the public defender, and then their incarceration. So you got that issue, but you also have an issue with, we want people to come back and lead law-abiding, successful lives. And if you just warehouse somebody for 10 years and then you kick them out to the streets with no or little support and no family or community ties, and then you expect a miracle to happen, and then when it doesn't, we say, oh, you were evil because you were going to fail and go back to prison, commit a new crime anyway.
Yeah. Now, you were truly the aberration in the system because you have a little bit of a Shawshank kind of story here, because Andy Dufresne took things into his own hands, one in a couple different ways, legally and by digging the tunnel, but you started getting into law. This is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I got a job at the prison law library, and for the first couple months, all I did was hand out the books. They were big, they were thick, they were intimidating. When I did pull one down off the shelves and read it, felt like it was written in another language.
Right. Who was reading the books? I mean, was everyone there trying to solve their case? Was that like the thing?
Yeah, there were people, there weren't a lot, but there were people trying to fight their case, especially in federal prison when a lot of people were getting 20, 30-year mandatory minimums for a handful of crack cocaine. So people were trying to fight their cases, and I didn't want anything to do with that until June 26th of 2000. The Supreme Court handed down a decision called Apprendi v. New Jersey. I, like everyone else in federal prison, thought that this might apply to the federal sentencing guidelines, so I started learning the law on my own, and was never able to get any relief for myself, but what I found was I enjoyed solving this legal puzzle and kind of writing out the solution. So I started helping other people in prison.
Keep going. Then what happened after that? Because this is where it gets good, that then leads up to your career now and your whole life.
Yeah, I started writing memos for people, friends of mine, they're lawyers, saying, hey, check out these issues and here's some case law. The lawyers oftentimes would be like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, did people think you were nuts?
Oh, yeah,
or
they did.
What did the other prisoners think? Like,
well, I mean, they don't know good legal work from bad.
Right.
So many of them had bad lawyers to begin with, and they were desperate, so they would help me. And I finally started to write a brief or two, and we would file post-conviction motions. And the third legal brief I ever prepared was for a friend of mine named John Fellers, who was filing what's called a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court. I didn't know a great deal about the Supreme Court, but I knew it was different than filing in other courts. That court gets 8,000 petitions, 7,000 petitions a year. They grant 70 to 80 cases. You got a 1% chance.
Wow.
But the 1% is for lawyers filing briefs to the court. It is a different matter when you are filing pro se as an indigent prisoner with no lawyer and the prisoner's name is on the front cover.
Yeah.
The chance of getting one of those heard is about 1% of 1%.
Wow.
And so
do you know how many times that was done before you?
I think it's been done 20 times.
Wow.
25 times since the 1950s. Not a lot.
Yeah.
So, you know, I didn't think a great deal about John's case. I thought we were right on the issues, and I thought the issues were important. John transferred to another prison, and I forgot about his case until one morning at 6:30 in the morning, a friend of mine came running and screaming out of the housing unit, Shon! And, you know, us being federal prison, I thought, what did I say to him yesterday? He wants to come fight me at 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Usually when people are running and screaming at each other in federal prison, it's not a good sign. But you don't normally go to a fight carrying a newspaper in your hand, and what he had was a copy of the USA Today saying that the court had granted John Feller's case. How unlikely that was, given John had filed without a lawyer, and it actually quoted from the brief that I had pecked out on a prison typewriter. I knew that was a big deal. Did I know that it would lead to doing this work long term? No. Did I know I was going to go to law school or become a lawyer? No. And I certainly never thought I would end up as a law professor at Georgetown.
Yeah, so what happened right after that? I mean, did the prison administrators go, man, this guy's onto something here?
Well, the big break for John Fellers and myself was that an attorney took the case over, and not just any attorney. His name's Seth Waxman. He's the former Solicitor General of the United States and one of the top appellate lawyers in the country. He took the case, and I think most people with his background, Harvard undergrad, Yale Law School, clerk for federal judges, worked at the Department of Justice, was the Solicitor General, would have said, hey, good job, Mr. Jailhouse Lawyer without a bachelor's degree. Great work, we'll take it from here. And yet he did the exact opposite. They would send in, he and his firm, Wilmer Hale, would send in drafts of the brief. I would mark up it with notes, and I would send it back out. One point,
I mean, that's incredible.
I know. One point I had a conference call in my counselor's office with Seth and 3 other lawyers the week before oral arguments. And Seth asked me, Shon, can you think of any questions that the justices might ask that we haven't thought about? And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, I have been self-learning the law for 18 months. I've never even taken freshman English.
Yeah.
No, I have no idea what the court's going to ask you. And they started laughing. But it was quite the experience.
What do you make of, I mean, it's fascinating that Waxman was willing to do this. Do you think it was truly he was trying to get your insight as a prisoner? I mean, obviously he saw a good legal mind, even if it was a novice at the time. But do you think there was also like just like a PR element to that as well? Like, I'm going to stick with this guy and there's some value there too?
I think he was curious. I think he was curious that he had looked at this petition that was typed on a prison typewriter and had been granted, and he thought it was a really good work product. And he was surprised when he discovered that it had been prepared by a federal prisoner with no background in the law whatsoever, who had just kind of been picking this up on his own.
Yeah.
And I think he thought that there was value there, and you know, he became a mentor to me. We won the case 9-0, and he has been a good friend. He introduced me a couple months ago at the DC Bar Gala as I won Young Lawyer of the Year award, and
wow.
Seth walked up there and introduced me to the crowd, and we were just sitting there at the table thinking, things have come full circle for us.
Yeah, it's so funny because you're a young guy. The idea of like typing this thing up on a typewriter, just that alone. Do they have whiteout in prison?
Yeah,
oh, there's whiteout?
Yeah.
You'd think you could trade that because I feel like there's some value to. There's probably things you can do with whiteout.
Oh yeah. I typed up a lot of things on a prison typewriter. Almost all the briefs I prepared. I never was allowed to touch a computer while I was incarcerated. So when I get out in 2008, I had never been on the internet.
Incredible.
Never seen an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. One of the things that I struggled was finding a job. It was 2008. It was the height of the recession. No one was finding work, let alone the bank robber that just did 11 years in federal prison.
Yeah. Tell me about that day when they officially say to you, okay, you're getting out a little early. And then what is it like when you're actually putting on, are you literally putting on the clothes that you walked in with that they saved
no,
for you? That's sort of the image that we all have, right?
Somebody had sent me clothes. My brother picked me up to take me to the halfway house. I still had 6 months of custody with the BOP, but I was going to serve it at the halfway house across the river from Nebraska in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And my brother picks me up, and we drive, and we go to a Walmart, and I needed to pick up toothpaste. And I remember just being stuck in the Walmart in an aisle because there was a wall of toothpaste. And I had not had choice for over a decade, and it was overwhelming. And I'm not one that stresses or gets a great deal of anxiety, but I can tell you my first 30 days at the halfway house, I was consuming 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day and losing weight.
Wow.
Just because of the anxiety of trying to figure out this new world.
Yeah.
You know, one of the places, my big break was getting a job with Cockle Legal Briefs, this company in Omaha that helps lawyers all over the country file briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court. They had asked me, I told them I had this reference letter from Seth Waxman. That really impressed them. I didn't tell them the rest of the story.
Yeah. Don't ask where I was for the last 11 years.
They said, send us a PDF. I didn't know what a PDF was. No one else in the halfway house did either. So when I walk into the interview, I have to pull this reference letter out of my pocket and hand it to them.
Yeah.
And you know, if that costs me that job, I'm not sitting here today.
So tell me about that. So now you're. Oh, you know what? Let's just do a little more on prison itself, and then we'll move into everything that you're working on now. I think when we think of prison, you know, so much of it is just what we see in TV and movies. You know, I watched Oz years ago. I watch Orange is the New Black now. Like, we think of like just so much crime actually in prison, which sounds like it should be the reverse of the way it is, but yet there is. How much of that did you see in the federal system?
I saw more I saw more drugs in federal prison than I ever saw outside.
As someone that was doing drugs before you went in.
Yeah,
so it's not
there were several guards that were federally indicted during my time in prison. It's kind of ironic to me that you have a prison with two fences with razor wire around it and really high security, and we can't keep the drugs out of federal prison. How are we ever going to do that for an entire country?
Yeah.
That's why the war on drugs will never be successful.
Was there a real difference in the type of prisoner that was there for, obviously there's some, well, bank robbery is not considered that's not a white collar crime, right? No, it's a violent crime, right, of course. So, but is there a difference between, okay, so you have someone that's, murderers and rapists, and, then there's the sort of a lesser violent crime, something like a bank robber, versus just the people that did drugs, either sold, but I'm really talking about the people who just did drugs. Was there a real sort of separation between those two types of people?
No. What I saw in prison was there was a small sliver of people who were dangerous and who would be very difficult to reform without a lot of behavioral changes.
Yeah.
But it's a very small sliver. Most of the people I saw, especially people for drug crimes, most of them were doing drugs and selling drugs to support their habit, and they just needed a year or two of being clean.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the problem is they would get clean after 2 years and realize, oh, I've got 18 more years to do in federal prison. I also just saw a lot of guys that, were just regular guys that made bad choices and had amazing talents and had the capacity to get out and lead law-abiding, successful lives, but they needed a little support and they needed some incentives to take rehabilitation programming, and there wasn't a lot of programming at the prison.
Yeah. All right, now let's shift that. So you leave prison, you get your first legit gig. So what actually was your job, your first job?
Yeah, so I consulted with lawyers every day on the phone about filing their briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court. And, that first year was difficult for the people that worked at Cockle. It was difficult for my wife. I went from an environment with nothing but guys that were in federal prison for 11 years to an office of almost all women, and was with my wife, and I talked like a prisoner. I acted like a prisoner, and they had to really sand off some rough edges that first year.
Yeah. What's that? I mean, it's just a lot of fucks. I mean,
so I would get frustrated when a lawyer would call me up and say, hey, I've got this petition due in 2 days. And I would say, well, good, send it here. We'll help get you one Well, I haven't written it yet. And, they're representing someone who's got a 30-year mandatory minimum. That would make me mad. And one time I got called into the office manager and she said, Shon, our whole job here is customer service, so you can't really tell lawyers to get their shit together over the phone. Just little things like that I had been in a different environment, and it took me a while to adapt.
Yeah. Well, I think clearly that adaptation is what has led to some of your success. How much did you see sort of lawyers that were just part of the machine, that kind of weren't doing anything, wasting a lot of time so they could bill people, where for you it was like, I found this information, now I want to help as many people as possible and get things to happen in a timely manner, et cetera?
I see lots of lawyers who their clients are a source of revenue for them. That happens every day and in every field, not just criminal law.
Sure.
But I also see a lot of lawyers who are very passionate and advocates for their clients, who do a lot of things for their clients that they're not getting paid for. And those lawyers I admire, because it's not easy to represent criminal defendants in the American criminal justice system.
Yeah. So when did you get into teaching? When did you decide to make that move?
Well, first I went to law school, and then after that I decided that my first job I'd like to clerk for a federal judge. And had a lot of people tell me, that may not be able to happen for you, Shon. You've done well in law school, but there may be some people that will not think that you should be clerking. And I also got some advice from people when I was in law school about, if you do apply for a federal clerkship, only apply to Democrat appointees. Republican appointees will not give you the time of day given your background.
Interesting.
And yet, almost every judge that interviewed me or was interested in me was a Republican appointee. And ultimately it was Judge Janice Rogers Brown, who was one of the most conservative judges on the DC circuit. She's no longer a judge now. It was her that hired me, former bank robber, to come be her clerk at the second most important court in the country.
Yeah. So I want to obviously get into your time there, but what do you make of that statement that you just said, that people said, well, it'll probably be a Democrat, but it turned out to be a Republican?
Well, I think people don't realize that. I think for a lot of conservatives, they really, redemption stories resonate with them, whether it's the faith aspect or just, you know, they probably view me as a pick yourself up by the bootstrap story, which that's not entirely accurate, because if I don't have people like Seth Waxman and my wife, none of this happens. But I think that resonated with them, and they, you know, I had lots of judges who wanted to give me an opportunity.
Yeah. And now basically you are helping a lot of young people get that opportunity right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
I call chambers of federal judges all the time to try and get my students clerkships.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I spent a year clerking, and I got to see kind of how the sausage is made at an appellate court. And
what was the most mind-blowing part of that? Were there things that you saw that you were like, wow, this is really messed up, and this will probably lead us to a lot of the issues that you're fighting about all the time?
Well, I was surprised sometimes at the level of advocacy. Even on a court in Washington, D.C. that's viewed as the second most important court in the country, a lot of times the advocacy was really bad, especially in criminal cases.
You mean the public defenders?
Public defenders, but even privately retained lawyers. At least public defenders care, and so they won't just check it in. But I saw privately retained lawyers that would file things that were incomprehensible. I also saw government agencies that did that. So, you know, I mean, at the DC Circuit, you get a lot of administrative law decisions. I felt like I needed an acronym chart. EPA and NLRB, and the worst was FERC. No one wanted FERC cases.
Should I even ask?
Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Anytime someone wants to build a pipeline, FERC is involved. Anytime someone wants to do nuclear energy or electric energy, FERC is involved, and they're constantly being sued. And they're not the most exciting cases in the world.
Right. So to that point, though, how much did you see, you're talking about the sausage being made, how much did you see of just sort of like a corroded system, like just a lot of nonsense that didn't need to be there, you know, just like a lot of brush in the way?
Well, I think the law is way too complex, but I was astounded at the judges on the DC Circuit. These are incredibly smart people who really care, and I was impressed by all of them. Just their dedication to the work and trying to find right answers. And so many of how we think about courts is politically based on divided decisions between conservatives and liberals. But for most of those cases we had at the DC Circuit, it was not a political issue. And so it was an issue that basically all the judges were trying to just find the right answer.
Yeah. After being around this, after being in prison and part of that system, and then, you know, working with judges and now teaching and all that, how much do you think politics sort of seeps into all of this? Do you think people are, judges, I'm talking about lawyers, everybody, do you think, public defenders, do you think people are able to remove their own political biases?
No, of course not. Of course not. I see politics plays a big role in everything, even the courts, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. What I would say is that, again, there's a large number of cases that don't involve that are pretty straightforward, and that is the bulk of federal court's docket. It's just we tend to focus on the big case, especially at the Supreme Court, the 5-4 decisions.
Sure.
And we don't realize that there are a whole lot of unanimous decisions and a lot of collegiality on the court, except for in the big political cases.
Yeah. So there are a couple issues that are sort of your pet issues now that are very personal to you, obviously. So mandatory minimums, you are not a fan, to say the least.
Awful.
Okay,
well,
so just describe what they are first.
So mandatory minimums are where Congress sets a particular mandatory floor for the judge has to impose that sentence. And I'll give you an example of one of the worst ones. There is a statute that says if you use a firearm during a crime of violence or a drug trafficking crime, you get 5 years, consecutive to whatever else you get, whether it's bank robbery, drug crime, And then every second time you
Wait, so consecutive. So this is happening at the same time no matter what.
So if you get 3 years for the robberies and this 5 years for the gun, you're going to do 8 years.
Yeah.
The second time you use it.
Oh, that seems not consecutive. I would have thought they're sort of built on top of each other, like you're serving both at the same time.
No, you serve one and then you serve the other.
Yeah.
And then you get charged with a second use of the firearm. It's 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
Had that played out for me and had I gone to trial, I would have had 5 bank robberies and these 5 gun charges. I pled guilty to the 5 bank robberies and 1 gun charge.
Mm-hmm.
My sentence was 12 years, 3 months. If I had gone to trial and been convicted of the 5 gun charges, I would have received a sentence of 92 years and 3 months.
Wow.
And the judge would have had to impose it. There's a very well-known case of Weldon Angelos, a man in Utah who had a young family, was selling marijuana to support his young kids, and made 3 small sales of marijuana while having a gun, and he ends up getting sentenced to 55 years.
Jeez.
He's now been released. I know other people. I've got a good friend who's named Adam Clausen who did 9 robberies, went to trial, and the only difference between his case and my case is I had a good lawyer, he didn't. I had a reasonable prosecutor, he didn't. I pled guilty. He exercised his right to a jury trial, and as a result, he got a sentence of 213 years in federal prison.
Wow.
Even though no one was physically hurt in the robberies.
So,
that makes no sense to me.
Yeah. So for as misguided as obviously you would argue these laws are, the counter argument would be that this is going to deter people. I think that's what the counter argument is. But as you said before, nobody understands this stuff. So have they done studies on that? Like, do they have any sense of what that is?
The literature all says that the thing that deters people is whether or not they're going to get caught, not the length of the sentence. No one's thinking about the punishment when they're committing crimes. Mm-hmm. And so you're getting very little deterrent effect.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, well, why do we impose mandatory minimums? And the government would say, well, we need mandatory minimums to get people to plead guilty. Well, we have a problem in the federal system with too many people plead guilty, 97%. Mm-hmm. And that shouldn't be our primary focus. And what I see
why is that so high, 97%?
Because the punishments are so high. If you are offered 3 years, and you might be innocent or have a triable case, and you're offered a plea deal of 3 years, but if you go to trial, you're going to get 20, what would you do? Even if you're innocent, what would you do?
Yeah.
You'd probably take the 3 years because the consequences are so severe. So all of these people that got these ridiculously high punishments, at first when I started seeing them, I thought maybe there is a connection to race or socioeconomic class. But really what I see are people that exercise their constitutional right to a jury trial, get thrown in prison for the rest of their lives, simply because they did that. And you know, the jury trial right it's the only right that's both contained in the body of the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. Yeah. The founders thought that this was a pretty important thing.
Yeah. So basically these laws, the system is sort of forcing you to not use your constitutional rights. I mean, that's really fascinating.
It's what they call a trial penalty. If you go to trial, you will get crushed because the Department of Justice has 5,000 federal statutes. Many of them contain mandatory minimum punishments. Just think about that, 5,000 things that you could potentially do that would warrant putting you in prison or jail. I'd argue that the United States Congress does not value your liberty if there are 5,000 things that they think are so serious that you could go to prison for.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say there's 5,000 things the United States Congress could be in jail for.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think most people break federal law all the time and don't know it.
Like what, for example?
People that omit something material when they're selling something on Craigslist or eBay. That's wire fraud. Mm-hmm. I can tell you the last 3 presidents of the United States committed a federal felony. All 3, there's a statute that says if you use or abuse drugs, any drug listed under the Controlled Substance Act, and then possess a firearm, it's like you're felon in possession of a firearm. Mm-hmm. President Clinton, what did he say? I smoked, but I didn't inhale. Yeah. President Bush admitted to using drugs, and so did President Obama. And all 3 of them have possessed firearms since then. Mm-hmm. They could have been convicted and sentenced up to 10 years in federal prison. So we have a Congress that has passed 5,000 things and write these really broad statutes. And when they do that, what they pass is no longer the law, because what is the law is whatever your local United States Assistant Attorney decides to prosecute. That's the law, not what Congress passes, because Congress has criminalized everything but really decided nothing.